I think John Kirby is ready to answer all
Yeah.
your questions.
Yes, that's right. We're
But
going to
I'm
hear
giving
from
you
the
a
horse's
flavor
mouth.
for what the establishment, said in even though we took them out of the establishment Washington D.C. Circle and brought them to Sedona, Arizona.
Well, Evelyn, thank you so much. And thank you to the McCain Institute for your help in putting this great timely preview of the G7 summit together. Thank you also to John Kirby for taking the time out of your busy schedule, particularly when the G7 is just days away. As Evelyn mentioned in her introduction, John Kirby is the coordinator for strategic communications for the White House's National Security Council. Previously, John served twice as the chief spokesman at the Pentagon, also served as the chief spokesman for the State Department. And John, before we get to the G7, if you don't mind, I just want to talk briefly about you. You've achieved the trifecta. You're a spokesman at the White House, the State Department spokesman, now, of course, spokesman over at DOD twice. How do you see your job? What's your approach to the job that you have right now and the job that you've had in serving in those other capacities?
In every of those situations and all those assignments, really my job has been to help articulate and explain foreign and defense policy. And that's really the same thing I'm doing here now. I'm over at the National Security Council as the coordinator for strategic comms. And so really there's sort of two aspects to that job. One is to help coordinate amongst the interagency what we're saying about national security policy and to get input from them on that process. But it's also to represent the National Security Council and the president publicly on issues of national security, foreign and defense policy. So in many ways, the jobs I've had before at the Pentagon and at the State Department were perfect training ground for what I'm doing now. It's very similar, except it's a little bit bigger umbrella. I mean, for instance, last week, I had the opportunity to talk about what was going on at the border in terms of migration challenges and the lifting of Title 42. That is not something I normally would have had to deal with either at the Pentagon or at the State Department. But frankly, I think my training there really helped me frame that up.
Now, the G7 gets underway Friday of this week. How does President Biden prepare for this summit?
President Biden is very much looking forward to this. I think you've heard him talk about this, and all expectations are that he's going to be leaving on Wednesday to go to the G7. And this is a forum he's very comfortable in, and certainly he had a terrific G7 last year in Germany. Looking forward to this one in Japan. There's really three big muscle movements, maybe four, that you think about when we go to the G7. One is, of course, China, and I think you're going to see that that all the G7 leaders are going to be like-minded when it comes to managing the competition that we're all in with China. I think you'll see them articulate that. Two is, of course, the war in Ukraine and making sure that we continue to hold Putin accountable for this war. Three is a clean energy transition. And a transition means just that, John. I mean, we're not talking about some abrupt movement to clean energy technology. It's going to take time. And it's really important that the G7 leaders have the same sort of vision on how to manage a transition to clean energy technology, and they do, and you're going to hear them talk about that. And then the last thing, and I say it last, but it's definitely not the least of importance, and that is investment in infrastructure and economic development of developing nations. At the last G7 in Germany, President Biden put before the group this idea of a partnership for global infrastructure and investment, and they look forward to talking about how we've actualized that since last year's G7, the kinds of investment and economic opportunity that we're trying to develop in developing nations. So lots on the agenda, but he's very much looking forward to it.
Well, the president will be half a world away, and to some extent, it seems that this summit will be overshadowed or could be overshadowed by the debt ceiling deadlock with Congress. How does that factor into the planning for this upcoming summit?
The president can still have conversations with congressional leaders and work on the debt ceiling while he's overseas. He very much is certainly capable of doing that and plans to do that as appropriate. But you've heard him say that, look, if there needs to be adjustments to his travel to be back in D.C., then, he'll make those decisions as appropriate. But right now, the expectation is we're going to go to the G7 on Wednesday. We're going to have a terrific set of discussions about things that absolutely affect our own national security and our own national economic health. And all the while, he can stay in touch with congressional leaders.
Is that a big part, John, of the president's message to his counterparts that the debt ceiling deadlock will soon be resolved and that the U.S. will not default on its debt obligations?
The president talked about that this weekend. He's very optimistic that we're going to be able to get a debt ceiling increase. Now, the process of getting there obviously is still being worked out. The teams are still talking about what the negotiations can look like. It's expected that the president will have another opportunity to meet with congressional leaders here this week before he leaves for Japan. But look, it's really important that and this gets into the debt ceiling argument. It's important that the world sees the United States as the stable power that it is, and that our economic strength is not putting at jeopardy our strength in other areas of national security. It would be a terrific gift to China and to Russia if we were to default, because they could just point the finger and say, look, see, we told you the United States is not a reliable partner. It would obviously it could have effect on national security investments. Secretary Austin has already talked about the fact that pay and benefits for some troops could be affected. It certainly could have an effect down the road on potential sanctions enforcement. I mean, so there are real national security implications. And one of the messages that the president will bring to Japan with him is the United States is reliable. We are strong. We are capable, and our leadership in the world remains really, really critical. And he does feel optimistic that we're going to get this debt ceiling increase. Now, again, what that looks like and the timing of it, I think all that the teams are working out right now.
It seems that message that the president will deliver to his counterparts also seems like a message that he will deliver to the leaders that will actually be at the White House tomorrow. He's heading over to Japan, essentially saying to these leaders, Republican, Democratic leaders from the House and the Senate, we need to send this message to the world. We need to send this message to our allies, but also to our adversaries that America can be relied on in terms of paying its debt obligations.
That's exactly right. I think you'll hear him talk about that more than once over the course of the next few days. Here he is getting ready to go to Japan to meet with G7 leaders about, as I said, 4 really big, important areas, not only to our national security, but to the security and economic health of so many other nations. And he does so with this still hanging over us. And that's just not healthy for the United States and for our reputation. So again, the president's optimistic we'll get there. He's going to keep working at it. The teams are going to keep working at it. But it's all the more important that he goes to Japan to meet with the G7, to be able to express that same optimism and his commitment to making sure that America's place on the world stage remains unchallenged.
Well, let's get into the focus. And you talked about all those different areas that will be the focus of this upcoming summit. Number one that I want to talk about is Ukraine. It was the primary focus, it seemed to me, at last year's G7 in the Bavarian Alps. Yeah. This year, any less of a focus on this particular issue? What's the message that I think you would like to see coming not only from the president, but from our allies at the G7?
I think it's certainly going to be a major topic of discussion. And I think what you're going to see, John, is that the G7 leaders are going to and have stayed united when it comes to supporting Ukraine. The resolve, the determination is still there. You saw over the last few days, President Zelensky was in Europe himself, meeting with many leaders of the EU, including President Macron of France. And those were very solid, very public demonstrations of how much support President Zelensky and Ukraine still have inside Europe. And so I think you're going to see the same resonant message from the G7, and the G7 is going to have the opportunity to hear directly from President Zelensky as well. So I think you're going to see coming out of the next few days, again, a strong international community commitment to supporting Ukraine as they get ready to renew offensive operations here in the spring and in the weeks and months ahead, now that we're in spring and the weather's improved. we want to make sure, all of us in the G7, that President Zelensky has what he needs, the tools, the capabilities, the training that he needs to be able to go on the offense if and when he chooses to do so.
John, we saw over the weekend President Zelensky in Europe getting additional commitments from a number of G7 countries, from Italy, from France. Today, he's in the UK. And these are commitments as it relates to help militarily and perhaps even in terms of humanitarian aid as well. What are you expecting at the G7? Any further announcements from any other countries about providing additional support to Ukraine going forward?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of specific announcements in Japan. I do think there will be a robust discussion among the leaders of the G7 about supporting Ukraine going forward. I'll let them, obviously, these are all sovereign decisions. Every nation speaks for themselves. The G7 doesn't impose upon any individual member to provide stuff to Ukraine. But all of these countries have been supporters of Ukraine, and I think you're going to see that support continue. As for the United States, we will continue to support Ukraine. You've been seeing us roll out security assistance packages about once every 2 weeks or so. That will continue in the weeks and months ahead. Again, I don't want to get ahead of where we are or have any or get ahead of announcements for the president, but I do think you'll see, certainly in the context of the G7, but even outside the context of the G7, that the United States is going to be demonstrably continue to lead and to be in support of Ukraine.
You're a policy guy, John, but there are politics associated with Ukraine in Congress. We see that there's a very small band of Republicans in particular that have been reluctant to support Ukraine. Is this problematic? I mean, it's a different dynamic this year than existed during the first 2 years of President Biden's first 2 years in office. Is this problematic, or do you think that you see enough bipartisanship to get over that very small opposition that we see?
We've enjoyed terrific bipartisan and bicameral support for the things that we've been doing to support Ukraine. It's the Senate, it's the House, it's Democrats, it's Republicans. And if you listen to the new House Republican leadership, Representative Chairman Comer of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and Speaker McCarthy, who was very, very vocal just a week or so ago, that support, continued support for Ukraine, is still solid. It's still there. It's still bicameral and it's still bipartisan, and President Biden appreciates that. We are grateful for that support, and we have every expectation that that support will continue. Now, you're right, John. There's a small number of House Republicans who have been vocal about not supporting Ukraine or expressing concerns about that support. And certainly that's their right to do that, but they don't represent the majority of Republicans in the House. They certainly don't represent the majority of Republicans in Congress. And we're going to continue to stay at this effort. Now, the next question that I often get is, well, you know, you got the $45 billion to help you get through this fiscal year. You know, are you going to have to go back to Congress for more, and when would that be? And we're just not at that point where we know. Certainly, if we feel like we need to go back to Congress towards the end of this fiscal year and ask for additional support, we'll do that, as we did last year. But right now, we're focused on executing to the funds that Congress generously appropriated for us to support Ukraine. We're still in the middle of executing to that appropriation, and you know, as I said, you're seeing continued support for Ukraine just about every 2 weeks.
If you had a message, John, that you would want to deliver to that very small group of Republican House members in particular, I think there might be one member I can think of, Josh Hawley in the Senate, but if you had a message to deliver to them about why this aid, this military aid, is so important and why Ukraine's fight against Russia is so important in terms of showing support for Ukraine, what would be your message? Why is it so important?
There's a couple of things I would say. Well, number one, and this will sound corny, but it's true. This is about independence. And if there's any founding ideal that matters to Americans, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, whether they live in rural America or urban America, it's this idea of independence and freedom. And that is exactly what Ukraine is fighting for, their right to exist as a country. I mean, so at the very core, that should be something we all can understand and get behind. And let's not forget, the United States could not have won or preserved our independence without foreign help, without other countries coming to our assistance, whether that was France, of course, in the Revolution, or the support we got from so many other corners. And they were able to preserve that over the last 250 years. So that's number one. Number two, there is a significant challenge that Mr. Putin is posing, not just to Ukraine. Clearly, there's a challenge to Ukraine, but to our European allies and partners, to the continent, frankly, to the world. He's trying to undermine the very rules-based order that this country, United States, helped put in place after World War II. And I know that sounds like some arcane policy, rules-based order, but basically it means that it's the charter of the UN, that countries have a right to exist. They have a right to conduct business on their own. They have a right to make sovereign decisions about who they associate with and who they won't associate with. They have a right to exist, to be free. And he's challenging that very idea. And if he wins in Ukraine, because and John, don't make no mistake, he still has the same strategic objectives in mind. Though the fighting is more confined to the Donbass area in the south, he still wants to see Ukraine taken off the map as a free country. Those strategic aims have not changed. If he gets that, if we just walk away, where does it end? Where's the next border he goes running up against? And it's not too far before you get to NATO. And as the president has said, we're going to take our NATO commitments very seriously. We're going to defend every inch of NATO territory if it comes to that. And then you're talking about a much bigger war. And if you think, for those members of Congress who are worried about the cost of supporting Ukraine the way we have over the last year plus, think about the cost to our blood and our treasure if it goes beyond that. If we end up in some sort of larger conflagration or war with Russia because Mr. Putin has been emboldened by what he's able to do in Ukraine, it would be exorbitantly higher, the cost in blood and treasure to the United States and to our people if we allow that to happen. So there's an awful lot at stake here.
So nearly 15 months into this war, we've seen this unity, not only from the U.S., but also from our European allies or allies in Asia. In fact, all allies, it seems, of the U.S. around the world in terms of supporting Ukraine. But on the sanctions front, let me ask you, first of all, John, are the sanctions against Russia, are they working?
They are having an impact on Mr. Putin's ability to wage war. I mean, why else would he be going to Iran for drones and trying to, shop to North Korea for artillery shells? And we know that he has blown through a significant portion of his inventory on cruise missiles, precision-guided munitions. And the export controls and the sanctions, we know, have put a crimp in his ability to replenish the stocks of those weapons, particularly precision-guided weapons, because he can't get the microelectronics that he needs to make those, to manufacture them and to make them effective on the battlefield. So we know they're having an effect. Well, we said from the very beginning, and this is important for people to remember, that the economic tools like sanctions and export controls, they take some time. And yes, his economy hasn't been completely ruined, but it has been hurt deeply over the past year plus. And he has had, yes, he's been able to prop up his economy, but by doing radical measures, economic measures, like, playing around with interest rates and propping up the ruble. I mean, he has gone to great lengths to try to make it to the Russian people, make it so that there's no impact of this war. But those drastic measures can't persist for too much longer. He's going to have to reckon with the economic impacts that these sanctions and export controls are starting to have on his economy. It's going to take some time. We said that back then. It would take some time, and you're beginning to start to see the cracks now in his economic foundation.
Could we expect to see any additional sanctions announced at this upcoming G7 summit?
Well, again, I won't get ahead of the G7 or the leaders, but I do think that, just broadly speaking, you will see the G7 leaders address and talk about and make clear to the rest of the world that they are serious about holding Mr. Putin accountable and using economic tools to do that.
Let's turn to China, another focus, primary focus at the G7. First of all, how does this administration view China? Just, is it an adversary? Is it a competitor? And are we talking about an adversary and competitor solely on economic issues? What about national security issues? And do our allies view China, in your view, John, in the same manner?
I think, obviously the allies should speak for themselves. And when you say allies, it's, that's bigger than just the G7. But let me go back to the first question. First of all, nothing has changed about the way President Biden views the PRC. And he talks about it all the time. They are a strategic competitor. And he believes that the United States is poised to succeed in that competition. And you ask whether it's economic or security, it's across the spectrum. Certainly it's economic competition. There's no doubt about that. But there's also competition in the national security space as well, as China gets more bellicose and more aggressive and more coercive, particularly in places like the South China Sea and certainly the tensions with respect to the Taiwan Strait. So we've got to make sure that the United States is best positioned to win in that strategic competition. But we don't, and this is an important point, we do not seek a conflict with China. And there's no reason for these tensions in the relationship to devolve into any kind of conflict. That's why we want to keep the lines of communication open. You saw that that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had a chance last week to meet in Vienna with his counterpart from the PRC. Good, constructive, candid conversations. Did they agree on everything? Of course not. We don't agree on everything with the PRC. But the fact that we could have that conversation is a good step. And we want to keep those lines of communication open.
President Trump imposed trade tariffs during his administration on China. Those trade tariffs remain in place. Is there any difference in the policy towards the PRC that the Biden administration has towards China versus the Trump administration's approach?
I can't speak for the Trump administration. I can just speak for President Biden. And as I said, I mean, he really wants to manage this competition in a responsible way. As a matter of fact, when he had a chance to meet with President Xi in Bali, both leaders agreed that they need to be responsible in managing this most consequential of bilateral relationships. There's no other bilateral relationship that means as much to the world as the U.S. and China relationship does. And it's not in a terrific place right now. We all recognize that for many different reasons. But coming out of the discussion in Bali, there was a sense that we were going to get the two teams together and move forward and try to manage that relationship more responsibly than it had been before. And then, of course, things, obviously things transpired that made that more difficult for us to do. The president wants us to get back to that spirit of Bali. That's why Jake had a chance to meet with his counterpart in Vienna. And that's why we're still working on getting Secretary Blinken back. Maybe even visits by Secretaries Yellen and Raimondo to talk about economic issues. And of course, the president has said he's willing and he wants to talk to President Xi again. We'll manage that at the appropriate time. But what we're focused on is where we are now in this relationship and how we move it forward in a way that is, as I said, responsible, but also in keeping with the national security interests of the United States.
There's this term, John, that's applied very recently to the PRC, economic coercion, and it applies to a variety of policies that China has imposed upon the West, upon the U.S., our allies as well, whether you're talking about hampering or blocking foreign competition or failing to adequately protect foreign intellectual property. Those are big issues that certainly impact our economy. What is it that can be accomplished at the G7 to confront this particular issue of economic coercion?
Well, you're right. And, as I said, and you said yourself, I mean, the economic component of this relationship is in many ways a competition. And we've got to make sure that we can compete, which means you got to make sure that the playing field is level or as level as possible. And China doesn't play fair in economics, and there is intellectual theft, and there is coercion, using economic levers, almost weaponizing them, and affecting the economic security not only of the region but of the world. And so I think the G7 leaders, well, I don't think, I know that they're going to talk quite a bit about the PRC relationship from an economic perspective. And again, I don't want to get ahead of the discussions or what they might have to say after those discussions. But I think it's you can certainly expect that the G7 leaders will talk about the competition with China from an economic prism and what that looks like going forward, and what we've got to do collectively to make sure that things like critical mineral supply chains remain resilient and available to all of us. Things like labor practices and having a common set of values with respect to how products are actually manufactured and produced in terms of labor practices. There's a standardization and there's a moral and ethical value placed on that. So I think you're going to hear them talk about all this.
You mentioned the word talk. Talk is good, but talk doesn't lead to action. And I'm curious. It seems to me, watching this play out over all these years, that the U.S. and the EU have enormous economic clout when put together, when working together. The G7 also has enormous clout. Why can't that talk lead to some sort of action and confront China on these particular issues?
Well, it already is. First of all, you have to have talks before you can make decisions to act upon. I mean, that's all part of part of diplomacy. But there already has been work done with our EU partners, but with the G7 and frankly other nations as well outside the G7. And there will be many other nations invited to this G7, as I think you know, to put pressure on China on their unfair trade practices and to push back on their other coercive aggressive behaviors, even from a security perspective. So I mean, there already has been quite a bit of that. And again, I think you're going to hear more from the G7 leaders on this in coming days.
We know that there have been, I guess you might call them warnings. You might use a different word because you're a diplomat, John, to China as it relates to the idea of China helping out Russia militarily in its war with Ukraine. Where do things stand on that front? Is China helping out? Have they helped out? Are they still discussing helping out Russia militarily in their war against Ukraine?
We have not seen the Chinese make the step of providing lethal capabilities to the Russian armed forces. And that's still where we are today. We watch this as best we can. We're still certainly concerned about that. We don't believe it's in China's best interest to provide those kinds of capabilities to Mr. Putin. And we're going to keep making that point to the Chinese. Privately, we certainly have made it publicly going forward. We don't want to see them take that step, and they haven't yet. And so again, we'll keep watching that. That said, look, I mean, we're not Pollyannish about this. The Chinese haven't condemned the invasion. They haven't participated in any of the sanctions regimes, either certainly not unilaterally, but even multilaterally, the ones that are in place. They at the very least have provided some sort of tacit support to Mr. Putin by saying it's a no limits relationship, and President Xi went to Moscow, and we know that there is a burgeoning defense cooperation between the two countries. So look, we're going to watch this as closely as we can, but we haven't seen China take that step, and we don't want them to. We don't believe that's in their best interest. It's certainly not in the best interest of the people of Ukraine. And therefore not in the best interest, quite frankly, of the people of Russia for this war to be able to continue. No country should be looking for ways to support Mr. Putin. No country should be making it easier for Mr. Putin to kill innocent Ukrainians. Now, the other thing, and you didn't ask about this, but it's worth bringing up, is that China has put forth a 12-point peace proposal, if you will. And President Xi did call President Zelensky. We were very much in support of that. We had been urging him to do so for quite some time, and we're glad that he reached out. And the point I want to make here is that that China can have a role here. It is possible for China to have a constructive role in terms of helping us get to a just peace, getting to an end to the conflict in Ukraine. And so we're willing to continue to engage with our PRC counterparts to that extent, to see if that role could actually bring some sort of fruitful peace and dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. We don't think of that as anything other than a good thing, as long as that discussion is credible, as long as it can be sustained, and quite frankly, as long as it starts from a foundation of understanding Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian perspectives. And that's why we wanted President Xi to get on the phone with President Zelensky so much, because he hadn't heard the Ukrainian perspective. Only thing he had heard up until that point about the war in Ukraine was what he was getting from President Putin. And any deal, any peace proposal that's put on a table that doesn't include Ukrainian perspectives, that doesn't have the support of President Zelensky, is going to be dead on arrival. It's just not going to go anywhere. As President Biden has said many times, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It doesn't have to be the United States brokering this. And another third-party country, including China, could broker it. It just has to be credible, which means it just has to make sure that it's in keeping with President Zelensky's proposal for a just peace, and quite frankly, in keeping with the very principles of the UN Charter, which are at stake right now.
Taiwan feels threatened from China almost every day. They're following what's happening in terms of the war in Ukraine, and they feel perhaps this could be us. This could be us down the road as it relates to China. To what extent is the issue of Taiwan on the agenda for this upcoming G7 summit?
I think, first of all, we need to be very careful comparing Taiwan to Ukraine. I mean, these are two completely different. Taiwan has not been invaded, and there's no reason for there to be any PRC military action unilaterally to move in that direction. As President Biden has said, it's not inevitable, and there's no reason for it to occur since there's been no change to our one China policy. Are people looking at what's going on in Ukraine and trying to derive lessons about international support, about sanctions, about the kinds of military capabilities that are out there and available? I think, sure, of course they are, and we let the PRC speak for themselves about what they might be deriving from the war in Ukraine. But again, we don't believe that talking about Taiwan with some inevitability of conflict is helpful, and it doesn't have to be that way. Now, you asked, is the tensions with Taiwan going to come up at the G7? I would just tell you, broadly speaking, as I said right at the outset, China will be a very key part of the agenda. The entire aspect of managing competition with China, with the PRC, will be on the agenda for the G7 countries. And I think you'll see that they all are like-minded when it comes to how you manage that relationship going forward on all the different sectors: security, economic, political, diplomatic, information even. And so again, I don't want to get ahead of where they're going to be, but I definitely they will be talking about all the challenges that the PRC represent, and quite frankly, some of the opportunities that it represents.
Before I move on to the other items on the G7 agenda, I just want to wrap things up with China. Would you say that the U.S. relationship with China right now is perhaps at its worst moment in decades? Is that a fair assessment?
I would say that we are working hard to get back to the spirit of Bali, get back to the spirit of the conversation that President Biden and President Xi had in Bali. Coming out of it, I mean, two big things coming out. One was both leaders recognizing that as two of the most powerful nations on the planet, we've got to manage this relationship responsibly, and we got to look for ways to open up again the lines of communication that were closed off after Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. And number two, that we want to get the teams back together to start to work on those vehicles. And I think that's where President Biden wants to get to. He wants to get back to that spirit of Bali. So I don't know that, saying it's the worst it's been in decades. I mean, clearly it's not in a place that President Biden is comfortable with. And we don't believe that President Xi is entirely comfortable with where things are right now either. And so there's an opening here. There's an opportunity, and we want to take advantage of it. And that's why Jake Sullivan's trip to Vienna this week or last week was so important, to try to take advantage of keeping those lines open and moving forward, getting this relationship into a better place. And I think that's the way we're talking about it.
North Korea was a big focus of the prior administration, less of a focus, I would say, just covering the administration for President Biden. Is that a fair assessment? And also, to what extent will North Korea be a subject on the agenda at the G7?
I don't think it's a fair assumption, John. I recognize that there hasn't been quite the theatrics here over the last couple of years that we saw in the Trump years with respect to North Korea, and we recognize that Kim Jong-un continues to conduct provocative missile launches and continues to advance his nuclear ambitions. We're not blind to that. We understand that, and we have, since the beginning of this administration, made it very clear to the regime in Pyongyang that we'd be willing to sit down without preconditions. Sit down and start to talk about the denuclearization of the peninsula. Again, no strings attached. And Kim Jong-un is not interested in that, clearly. We continue to make the offer. He continues to rebuff it, continues to conduct testing and experiments to advance his military capabilities, to continue to threaten not only the peninsula, but the region. So what we're doing in response to that is very demonstrable, very tangible, and very meaningful changes to our own security footprint on the peninsula and in the region. We have added additional intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets so that we can get a better sense of what's going on there in Pyongyang and on the peninsula. We have recommitted now to conducting, again, very tangible, sizable military training exercises with our South Korean counterparts. You saw, in fact, in response to those big training events, that the North Koreans reacted to that. So they can certainly feel the effort and the time and attention that we're putting to security needs there on the peninsula and in the region. And quite frankly, and this gets buried, when we talk about Pyongyang, and I understand that your question is about Kim Jong-un and discussions with him. And of course, Trump very famously met with him. But what we've done, what President Biden has done, is really focus on that vast network of alliances and partnerships that we have in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, many Americans don't understand or know that 5 of our 7 treaty alliances are in the Pacific region. 2 of them, between the United States and South Korea and the United States and Japan, are 2 of the most important in the region. And what President Biden has done is really shore up and reinvigorate those 2 alliances, really putting, real resources behind it, as well as encouraging those 2 nations to work closely together. And now the Republic of Korea and Japan are doing things together with each other in the military space that they would not have done in recent years, because we have really focused on, again, revitalizing this network. And we are working on improving trilateral cooperation between the 3 of us. And you've seen that just recently in a trilateral exercise that we conducted out there. So we are putting not just a commitment of words and dialogue to Pyongyang, but we're also putting a commitment in the kinds of security resources and assets that we're placing in the region.
So much attention, it seems, comes out every week on the war in Ukraine and also on the relationship with China. It seems as if the issue of Iran and the threat that it poses to the region has receded itself to a certain extent to the back pages, but it is still a threat to the region. And what we've seen, in fact, is Iran trying to patch things up diplomatically with some of the countries that have not been in favor with Iran over the past few decades. So to what extent is Iran a part of the conversation at the G7? And to what extent, John, are you concerned about Iran patching things up, so to speak, with Saudi Arabia?
So two very different questions there. In terms of the G7, obviously tensions in the Middle East, we can certainly expect to come up as part of the G7, as they frequently do, because it's not just a military security issue. It affects economic security, it affects food security, And it certainly has an impact on what's going on in Ukraine, because now Iran and Russia have deepened their level of cooperation. We continue to see that even now. And that has repercussions, not just in Ukraine, but it has repercussions in the Middle East. If Iran is able to benefit from Russian military capabilities at home, it will affect their security footprint, their capabilities in the region. And so they're very much of concern, and I have every expectation the G7 leaders will talk about that. But as for Iran and Saudi Arabia, I mean, I think a couple of things. Number one, it's a good thing if there's more dialogue between two countries that have been literally at each other's throats for so long, that they can have some sort of path or vehicle for communications, just like we're talking about with the United States and PRC. Communications is a good thing, and so you'll see no sour grapes coming from the United States that they have brokered this avenue to restore some of their diplomatic relations. But I do think, and again, this is not sour grapes, but I do think we all need to keep this in perspective. What was brokered was basically a restoration of their diplomatic relations going back to about 2013. So that's good. But we have to keep it in perspective in terms of what it could actually mean for progress. I think we need to be appropriately pragmatic as we watch this develop. But the fact that they've restored diplomatic communications and relations is a good thing. Should it be able to lead to some sort of decrease in the tensions? But again, we can't take that for granted. Iran is still a destabilizing factor in the region. I mean, just in the last, couple of weeks, they've really stepped up their attacks on maritime shipping. And you've heard us, we talked about this last week, that the United States, in response to that, we're going to make some force posture changes in the Persian Gulf as we need to address this increased threat to maritime shipping, because that's not just a security threat, that is an economic threat that Iran's posing to the region and to the world, quite frankly. Iran still continues to develop a sophisticated ballistic missile capability that, again, we worry if that were to ever to find its way over to Russia and Russia's ability to fight this war in Ukraine. And obviously, Iran continues to support terrorist networks throughout the region, and that's a problem in the Levant. It's a problem in Iraq. It's a problem in Syria. I mean, it goes on and on. So we're not blind to that, and we're going to stay focused on it using, again, our vast network of partnerships in the region.
Are other G7 nations on the same page in terms of the way to approach Iran? Is Germany, is France, the UK, are they also on the same page with the US?
Again, I would certainly don't want to speak for other countries. I can't do that. But I do think that you'll see coming out of the G7 that in the main, all of these leaders have the same concerns about Iran's destabilizing activity, its promotion of terrorist networks throughout the region, its attacks on maritime shipping, its growing ballistic missile capabilities, its support for Russia and Ukraine. All of that, all the G7 nations are aligned in terms of the challenges that Iran poses. Not to mention the fact, that they continue to spin their centrifuges and continue to try to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. Although they don't have it right now, they continue to try to develop that. That's also a significant threat, and that all the G7 nations agree we've got to continue to address.
You spoke at the top about those other agenda items that are coming up at the G7 summit. Let's talk specifically about climate and what you spoke of about this transition to clean energy. Explain what it is that you view as this transition. What kind of time frame are we talking about? And do other G7 countries have that same time frame?
I think all the G7 countries recognize that a transition to clean energy is going to take some time. I couldn't put a date on the calendar for it. It's going to, many years here to move to clean energy solutions as the predominant method of energizing industry and providing energy to homes and residences and to transportation. It's out there. The technology is there. It continues to be developed. It can't be done by any one country. It's got to be done as an international effort. China has certainly grasped onto this and is trying to become the world's leader in clean energy. I think that's reason enough alone for nations like the G7 and other countries around the world to step up our efforts to move to clean energy technology. And there's so many more jobs available to that. I mean, that is the future, and it will not only promote a cleaner environment and reduce costs to governing and to running enterprises and business, but it will provide also more opportunities for employment, more jobs in clean energy. So look, it's a transition, as we've described, and transitions typically don't happen overnight. They take time to wean industry and populations off of fossil fuels onto clean energy. That is a huge adjustment, and it's going to take a while, but it is the future, and there are immense opportunities out there, and we all can benefit from the innovation that these G7 nations espouse and engender. We can all benefit from that if we're willing to have open dialogue about it going forward. And the president's committed to that, and we expect to spend quite a bit of time here in Japan on exactly that.
Yeah, I would imagine so. After all, so many of the G7 countries have an automobile industry that is impacted by so many of these changes. Here in the US, I know you said you didn't want to put a timetable on that, but with an EPA rulemaking, it seems to me the focus of this administration is moving towards electric vehicles within 10, 11 years or so. We have 5% of vehicles sold right now that are electric, and getting it past the point of 50% within an 11-year time period also requires a huge infrastructure investment. And of course, the infrastructure law that the president signed will be helpful in that regard. But is that 11-year time frame a reasonable time frame to get from where we are right now, 5% of all vehicles sold being electric, to the point where more than 50% of vehicles sold in the United States would be electric?
It's ambitious, no question about it, but the president's committed to that, and he believes that there is enough energy, there's enough innovation, there's enough determination here in the United States to move on that, and to quite frankly, for the United States to be the world leader. As he said many times, he wants the United States, when it comes to certainly clean energy technology and electric vehicles, electric batteries, he wants the United States to be the beginning of the supply chain, not the end of it. So he believes there's a lot of potential here, and while it's ambitious, he's 100% committed to it.
You touched upon the idea of energy security, and we see this to a certain extent in the war in Ukraine, John. We see that Europe really has I guess you could say, bitten the bullet, so to speak, with what they've had to deal with, because there are a number of European countries that did depend on Russian energy up until this war started in February of last year. How do you think that they've approached that? And is this among those topics that will come up during the G7 summit?
Energy security is absolutely going to be on the agenda. They'll have a whole session devoted to energy security. You've already seen nations like Germany wean themselves off of Russian natural gas, and the president has stayed committed to making sure that we are providing alternative sources, particularly for natural gas, to our European allies and partners, so that they don't have to rely only on Russia. Mr. Putin has weaponized oil and natural gas. That's why we put in place a price cap on Russian oil, so that while we can keep the supply in the market somewhat stable, Mr. Putin isn't able to profit more than is appropriate profit from his oil on the market, so that he can then just turn that around and continue to fight this war in Ukraine. But we have, from natural gas to oil, we have led the world in trying to find alternatives, so that that while Russian commodities are still they still exist in the market, so that prices can stay stable. Again, it's limited, and he doesn't get too much of an opportunity to profit from it. And absolutely, that will be a part of the discussion.
John, one last thing. The president is heading to Japan, and he's going on to Australia, Papua New Guinea. That's a part of his travels. And he's doing so at a time that there are these debt ceiling talks happening at very high levels of government. You also have the issue that you spoke about, the issue at the U.S.-Mexico border with migrants heading there in extremely large numbers. What's your message out there to Americans that say to themselves, why is the president traveling to this G7 summit for 3 days when we have these major issues happening right here at home?
It's a fair question, and the president would tell you that this is exactly the time to make sure that we are communicating openly and candidly with our allies and partners around the world about these issues, and reaffirming and reassuring that the United States and our convening power and our leadership on the world stage will remain. That they can count on the United States. And that's one of the messages that the president will be bringing with him. He is optimistic that we'll get there on the debt ceiling. Again, the teams are working at this. He's going to have another meeting with congressional leaders before he leaves on the trip. That will do a lot to tell him where things stand as he gets ready to go to Japan and then later on to Australia. And he's also said that if he's really needed back here, he'll be here. I mean, he recognizes that, but right now he believes that it's a very important message to send to the world, to the G7, but to the rest of the world, that our commitments around the world, our leadership on the world stage, is not in doubt, despite the discussion and the debate and the negotiations over the debt ceiling, that the United States can be counted on. Everywhere he goes, leaders around the world are reaffirming for him that they believe that American leadership is important, whether it's through networks of alliances and partnerships or it's bilaterally. American leadership matters on the world stage, and he wants to make sure that he is backing that up with his presence. There's just too many things going on right now. We talked about this for the last hour, all these things, for us to be absent from those discussions. So it's the absolute right time for him to make a showing at the G7 and on the world stage to demonstrate that he's serious when he says America is back.
Admiral John Kirby, you are the coordinator for strategic communications at the White House National Security Council. You're the National Security Council spokesman. Thank you so much. We covered so much ground in this conversation. Great preview for the G7. Safe travels to you. I look forward to seeing you in Japan. Thank you to Evelyn Farkas, and thank you to the McCain Institute for putting this preview together. And safe travels to you, John.
Thanks, John. It was good to be with you. Great discussion.
And thank you, both of you, Johns, for the hard-hitting questions and for the sharp answers, as always. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.